Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Edgar and I are doing what we do best, spreading joy and Christmas cheer far and near. And while we finish decorating up the Poe Museum Christmas tree, why don't you join us for tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. If you had to guess, without Googling it, which of these do you think was Edgar Allan Poe's best-selling book during his lifetime? These are the contenders. During his lifetime, Poe published 4 books of poetry, 3 collections of short stories, 1 novel, 1 essay about the universe, and this book you've probably never read. And that brings us to Poe's best-selling book during his lifetime, The Conchologist's First Book. You can guess what it's about just by looking at the cover. There's pretty little seashells on there. It's a textbook on seashells. Here's how it came together. Poe had been trying for years to get a book of short stories published. It just wasn't happening. So he tried a little bit of everything, from editing magazines, to joining the army, to writing a play. He even tried to get a job as a school teacher, unsuccessfully. Then he met a conchologist named Thomas Wyatt. Now, Wyatt approached him with a writing assignment. Wyatt was a seashell expert and made extra money by traveling the country to give lectures about shells. This was a time when the public craved news about the latest scientific developments. So I suppose this audience was comprised of a mixture of science enthusiasts in addition to seashell collectors. After his lectures, Wyatt could sell copies of this conchology book he'd written. The problem was his sales were poor because his book cost $8, which is what some people made in a week back then. He wanted to be able to sell a cheaper book, probably about $1.50. At his lectures, but his publishers wouldn't allow him to write a new book that undersold his other book. So he and Poe hatched a plan. He would hire Poe for $50, which was about half a year's rent back then, to write a cheaper, smaller version of his own book, and just put Poe's name on it so it would sell better. And so the publishers wouldn't find out. It was fairly easy to work. Most of it consisted of condensing what Wyatt had already written, then writing a new preface, translating some passages from a French textbook, and then he could be done. But Poe didn't stop there. He took a look at all the engraved pictures of seashells throughout the book and decided they were all out of order. Wyatt, like a lot of scientists in the United States, grouped the shells and organisms from the most complex to the simplest. Poe thought this was backwards. He started with the simplest organisms and worked his way to the most complex, just like biology textbooks today do it. Keep in mind, this is still 20 years before Charles Darwin, Poe's exact contemporary, published on The Origin of the Species. So Poe didn't have anything about the theory of evolution to read. He was coming up with this himself. Now, Poe's book was released in April of 1839. By September, they already had to issue a second edition. And then in 1845, they issued a third edition. It turned out to be Poe's bestseller, but he didn't make any royalties. He still just retained the initial $50. Within a year of the release of the conchologist's first book, Poe finally found a publisher willing to publish a collection of his short stories. That one I told you about earlier, The Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. The problem is, they still were telling him short stories don't sell. Especially these old stories, a lot of them you already published in magazines and newspapers. Why would somebody want to buy this? So they agreed to print a small run of copies, but only agreed to pay Poe 20 free copies of his own book. So if you're doing the math, Poe got $50 for writing the introduction to a book about seashells and got nothing for a book of his own original short stories. Over 24 short stories included such masterpieces as The Fall of the House of Usher, Ligeia, and William Wilson. Now, right about the time the third edition of the conchologist's first book appeared in print, one of Poe's critics came out and said, "You are just plagiarizing this book, the conchologist textbook, by the British conchologist Thomas Brown." Little did he know that Poe was actually working with Thomas Wyatt to make a cheaper version of his book. Now, Poe, for his part, he did acknowledge his debt to Brown's studies and also to some French conchologists, so Poe is more than willing to give credit where credit's due. He never really took this book too seriously. He said, it's just a textbook. That's how they're written. Meanwhile, his stories are getting more popular than ever with the publication of the very first detective story, The Murders of the Rue Morgue, his treasure hunt mystery, The Gold Bug, that even got adapted into a stage play during Poe's lifetime, and finally, The Raven, Poe's most popular poem. So for the next edition of the conchologist's first book, he even took his name off the title page. He didn't really want to be associated with something like this he'd just done to make some extra money during the early part of his career. And over the years, Poe's short stories and his poetry became famous around the world, but his book on seashells was completely forgotten. That's why the Poe Museum was able to own about half a dozen copies of it. This one used to be in the Wayland Library. Still has a little tag right there. They decided to get rid of it, apparently. But this one, I found just a few years ago in the private collection of an old-time Poe collector. His collection had passed down to one of his daughters and on through the family, and just a few years ago, the last owner passed away. And the heirs decided they want to just toss out all these dusty old books in a dumpster, but they allowed me about an hour to go through the library and find out if there's anything the Poe Museum might be interested in having. And that's how we tracked down this copy of Poe's greatest hit. And you can see it today on display in the Poe Museum's Elizabeth Arnold Poe Memorial Building. Well, thanks for joining us this evening. And if you'd like to give that special someone the gift that keeps on giving, why not give them a gift from the Poe Museum's online store at shop.poemuseum.org? Because when you give a gift from the Poe Museum, you're not only giving your friend a gift, you're giving the museum a gift by helping support the Poe Museum. Then you'll feel good about yourself, thus giving yourself the gift. And if you'd like to help support the Poe Museum's work in preserving important first editions like the ones I've shown you tonight, why don't you become a patron and support the Poe Museum at patreon.com/Poe Museum. And now, as a way of thanking you for joining us this week, I'd like to show you more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats.